All right, me. It is sometime in mid-December, not December, mid-September, and I've just finished reading Things to Make and Do in the Fourth Dimension by Matt Parker, which is a book I've had since high school. I read about half of it between kind of high school, maybe college, and then I just kind of sat on it for a very long time. I still had the bookmark in it from, when I was halfway through reading it. Yeah, I think this was a book that I am still someone who, despite my degree being in English education and being a literature person and doing a lot of theater stuff, I still do love math, right? I do love math and the sciences, but there was never the spark or interest to continuously do it in the way that English and theater and camp have kind of given me. So, I kind of fell off the trail there. Certainly, I think I understood more of this book at a younger age, quite honestly, just because there's so much mathematics that, because I'm not in those fields and therefore I don't do them, conceptually I still have fragments of how some of these things work conceptually, but they don't click in the same way, or what I assumed the same way was. But also importantly, because I forgot this book is actually signed by Matt Parker, which is quite fun. If I remember to, I'll link his, I think it's still active, but Matt Parker is a mathematician, but he's also kind of like a stand-up comedian in a way. There was the Festival of the Spoken Nerd, I think that was the name of it, as well as the channel's Stand-Up Maths, which was using math in creative and interesting ways, right, and fun ways, right? And that's really what this book is about, is, in a standard classroom setting, right? It is, because there's so much rote and so much memorization, and so much of this has to become, especially as we get into higher mathematics, more abstract, right? It becomes very difficult to understand the real world applications for these things, right? Without then also spending a lot of time on what these applications actually are, right? And what Matt Parker does is he tries his best to take some really complex ideas and concepts and break them down into ways that some of them we can use within the real world, but just in a way that is more conceptually friendly, which I think is important, right? Because as we continue to move forward in our society, right, and more of the world is based around math and projects and concepts that are being generated by things that were created by humans but are not being themselves created by humans, right? Is that to have an understanding of how these mathematics works, as well as continuously expanding our field of what we understand, right, becomes incredibly important. Right, it becomes incredibly important to understand what this mathematics is actually doing, or how do we actually, incorporate new concepts from mathematics into the real world, right? Because as constantly gets discussed, right, is that so many of these things that we now take for granted about the way the world works is initially found within mathematical curiosities that we're not expected to have any sort of interest or decision, or just that, curiosities, right? And we're, being done for fun. But then all of a sudden, the prime numbers and the concept of how sequences work, and Mersenne primes and things like that, all of a sudden, or like, digital roots, and all of a sudden become the backbone of the way our entire modern system works, right? And these were just things that were being done by people for no real good reason other than, this is odd, this is strange, and then we find applications for them, right? And it's because of this, the human willingness to explore and be abstract in things, that then we can later put on an understanding to then provide function for them, right? Which I think is a very hard thing sometimes for people to understand, right? Is like this, as Matt Park gets into it in the last chapter, the nth chapter, is conceptually, right? We begin to have this understanding that as there was a couple papers that put it, it's like math is unreasonably effective, right? Because maths are this kind of man-made creation that exists, but then it also fundamentally describes everything, right? And it's hard to describe this relationship, but it's that we are taking and we are creating and then labeling things, rather than things being inherent and math being inherent to them, right? And so, it works one way in which we can discover things, and then discover things in mathematics, and then go from there. But we can't always discover things in the world and then find the mathematics for them, right? Or is it the other way? I can't even think straight on this, right? But it's this fascinating concept that as proven, right, is that this is a world that exists that will never, ever, ever be fully and completely understood, right? Which is it involved kind of with the continuum hypothesis, but then the uncertainty principles and things like that, of where no matter what, there's always going to be a way to disprove or find something that does not necessarily work within the assumed things in the world, right? And so you'll always be able to explore and identify and create with the mathematics, which I think is it's a fascinating thing. It's also a very terrifying thing. It's also a hopeful thing, right? Because I think we've kind of continuously hit this point in fiction, as well as kind of the world around us right now in 2025, of where there's this concept of where, like, when we start running out of things that we feel that we can create, this becomes this lack of desire to innovate and to change and to build, right? We become complacent within society, within ourselves, within whatever. And because of that, right, we stop thinking about what's next, right? And it becomes this really great fear of, where, like, I think from a human perspective, if we are just creatures that exist on this planet, and there is no higher being, or it is not a higher being that has direct involvement with us, or it's not a, even if it's direct involvement, does not necessarily have a place for us to go next, right, other than here. Then it becomes this really terrifying thing of what happens when we reach the end and there's nothing left to build, to create, which it's a terrifying concept, right? Because even though we can think of it as a life of luxury, right, there's only I would argue that our minds can only comprehend so much luxury and so much leisure before they feel the need to create something, right? Which is a thing that gets explored within. Shout out to one of my favorite modern authors, John Boyce, and 17776, as well as 20K20. And then the eventual book, the book that he just announced that he is working on, which is, I think he said it was 50,001, but right, is at the end, how do we figure out a way to give ourselves some sort of meaning, some sort of something interesting going on, something to care about, right? But yeah. I don't know. Like I said, I think that I understood this book a lot more and probably enjoyed it a lot more when I was actually younger, and which is more recent within the maths world. I still enjoyed it, but certainly there was a lot of it that went over my head and didn't quite understand or couldn't quite conceptualize in some way. Yeah. I think this book is a very good example of part of the reason why it's been taking me so long to read at this point. I've now moved twice within the year. Was at a job that took up almost all of my time and also my mental energy for a number of months. And right, the books that we're now at, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to finish out the books in the series that I owned before I also started getting a whole bunch of other books as I was working on this project. I was working on reading lists for, based on, posters, or based on lists, or based on, things that were possible for me to teach when I was in North Carolina, right? I got a whole bunch of books for that. And at this point, I'm trying to finish out the ones that I do have. But what that means is I have a lot of books that are dense like this, are long, or are series pieces like the Dan Brown series, right? Of where and that's another book of where that was just released, the next one, so I'm gonna go get that. But there's not a lot of these kind of short, quick pieces that I was able to crank out in 2 days, right? With that being said, I am now back to substitute teaching for the time being, and working at a theater, right? So I'll probably have more time, which means I'll probably read more over the next couple months. So who knows, but I might actually get my quota back up to where it should be. I might even finish all the books that I owned when I started this. The problem becomes there are some of these books where it's they're not dense and they're not long, but the way that they are packaged makes it really difficult, right? I have the entire Wizard of Oz collection, which is a whole bunch of short things, and it's 15 books or whatever technically, but instead of it being individual books, they're all it's in a coffee table type book, and I can't just lug that around everywhere. So even though it's a lot of stories, and a lot of reading, it's all reading that I have to do here, right? So yeah, that's that. I think that's all I got. Yeah.